New developments in art outside Italy are called Renaissance for the sake of convenience only. The Northern Renaissance was not a rebirth, as in the Italian Renaissance, which focused on a rediscovery of classical ideals from Rome and Greece. However, the Northern Renaissance keeps its name because of art produced which broke from the previous Gothic style. While very different, the artists of Northern Europe from this time produced a brilliant new art, like the Italians. Two major factors characterize the difference between the Italian and the Northern Renaissance. While the Italians looked to classical antiquity for inspiration, Northern Europeans looked to nature, which they reproduced in minute detail. Northern Renaissance painters first perfected the new oil medium, which allowed them great ease in blending rich colors. Art took different forms as well. Look at the information page, the comparison chart between Northern Renaissance and Italian Renaissance to make sure you understand those changes and those different forms. Florence, Rome, and Venice were the art centers of Italy. Bruges, Brussels, Ghent, Louvain, and Haarlem were their rivals to the north. The rich love of color, pattern, and detail, characteristic of the international style, found a home in the art of Northern Europe in the 15th century. While in some ways these artists might seem to be behind the times, in fact, they were far from being behind. Often the Northern artists chose alternate paths, and in the case of developing new techniques, oil, they were ahead of their Italian counterparts. They also developed printmaking techniques well ahead of their Italian contemporaries. For the most part, the arts of sculpture and architecture did not develop as distinctively in this period, and as a consequence, the focus in this lecture will be primarily on painters. Having said that, we are going to start off with the sculptor, the only one we'll look at. This is the work of Claus Sluiter. He was a sculptor from Holland who was hired by a French nobleman, Philip the Bold of Burgundy. Philip hired Sluiter to create his funerary tomb in addition to this sculpture entitled The Well of Moses. While Sluiter's work does not dwell on the weight shift principle that was revived by Donatello, he nonetheless combined powerful volumes with incredible realism in life-size sculptures which predate Donatello's work. Now, Sluiter also played a role in the development of what is known as disguised or hidden symbolism. Each of the prophets in this Well of Moses held ribbons that foretold the death of Christ, and the figures themselves formed the base of a huge crucifix. As Christ's blood is the water of life, the monument itself formed an actual well from which monks obtained their water. So, the Well of Moses isn't such a strange idea after all. The Champollion altarpiece seen here by Melchior Broederlam is an important work of transition in progress. Broederlam no doubt was familiar with Sluiter's work and sought to emulate his sculpture in paint. The work is unusual in that familiarity with the perspective of the South is apparent, but Broederlam is not quite sure what to do with the space that he's created or has to work with. When this work is compared to the work by Jean Pucelle, we can see that artists of the North have not had to deal with a complete pictorial space of some size, unlike their Italian counterparts who had a good 100-year head start in this respect. Comparing the red robe of the angel in the Annunciation to the drapery in the Well of Moses makes clear the move away from the handling in illuminations. As we prepare to see oil painting take over as the artist's medium of choice, it's interesting to see that oil pops up at roughly the same time manuscript illumination reached its zenith. Coincidence? Maybe. Or perhaps artists were looking for new methods in response to the seeming perfection and beauty of works done by the Limborch brothers that we'll look at next. This painting is by the Limborch brothers, and it's February. February is the international style at its best, far beyond even the conception of Gentile da Fabriano. An incredibly rich coloration is added to this decorative style, and that's particularly evident in the illustrations in your textbook. In addition to color, the Limborch brothers added the typical northern eye for detail and reality. This is October by the Limborch brothers. Nothing is missed, yet nothing is placed in this painting which does not contribute to the image. Many of the illuminations from this series are particularly successful in their larger, simple, abstract designs. It's almost as if this is three paintings in one. You have the figures working in the foreground, you have the incredible castle in the middle ground, and then that great series of concentric arches at the top. It's abstract, yet it's real. The various pages of their book display the activities of both peasants and nobles in the various months of the year. These themes will continue to be explored in the Northern Renaissance. In some senses, these artists had their feet more firmly planted on the ground than did the Italians in terms of subject matter. We can see how quickly the international style was put aside by looking at the work of Robert Campin. Previously attributed to the anonymous Master of Flamel, it fits the known data about Campin and his times exactly. Campin's work is significant for his carefully observed patterns of light and reflection. Campin's rather exaggerated perspective that we see in this painting is based on his visual experience, not a scientific theory, as was the case with the Italians. While the international style has been dropped, an incredible wealth of detail has been crammed into this small painting done in oils on wood, and this will be the typical format for the Northern Renaissance. Why so much stuff? Disguise symbolism pops up here again, and artists of the North will use this for a good 250 years to come. What's going on in Campin's Merode altarpiece? The white lilies in the vase and the water pot and the clean white towel refer to the purity of the Virgin Mary. The book she is reading symbolizes her wisdom. The two lions on the bench refer to lions which were on the throne of wise King Solomon, and so too they symbolize Mary's wisdom. There also is a left panel to this painting which shows a enclosed garden, and that's a common reference to Mary, while the roses specifically refer to her as, of course, the rose among thorns. In the right panel, you see a mousetrap, and that's there for St. Augustine likened the cross of Christ to a mousetrap in which the devil was caught by deception for not recognizing Christ's true nature. There's a lot going on here, and no doubt this work was far more accessible in its time, as people then considered all nature as a reflection of the divine. When a monk thought about a nut, He didn't just think about a thing to eat. The nut was a symbol of Christ's dual nature. The shell represents his human nature, and the nut meat his divine nature that was hidden in the shell of his mortal body. It's hard to say whether this humanization of art and religion has elevated the natural world to divine status or vice versa. It's merely important to recognize the religious fervor of the time in assessing this artwork. Robert Campin, his student Roger van der Weyden, and Jan van Eyck were the founding fathers of Netherlandish painting. Now, Jan's brother Hubert had long been thought to be the inventor of oil painting, and so idolized for this discovery was he that his right arm was preserved as a holy relic. Now, whether this is true or the origins of oil paint are much more old and more obscure, Jan van Eyck used this new medium to achieve a quick peak of realism in the Northern Renaissance. Hubert and Jan's most important piece is the Ghent altarpiece that we see here closed. It has many panels and is therefore called a polyptych. Like Campin's work, the Ghent altarpiece contains many symbols. Even its construction alludes to this fact as one opens the piece to discover the deep inner meanings beyond the simpler exterior meanings. The exterior refers to the coming of Christ and has at least one very direct reference to the holiness of the work. While the angel's words of annunciation are written in gold, so too are the words of Mary's response. Yet there is one major difference. Mary's words are written upside down, for they are directed to the Lord, not to us. When opened, the altarpiece reveals a magnificent awareness of the nature of God's love. Of particular interest are the figures of Adam and Eve, which differ greatly from the glorified nudes of classical antiquity, in that their unprotected, naked bodies reveal man's moral vulnerability. The sacrificial lamb on the altar in the bottom central panel symbolizes redemption. Even as Van Eyck uses all of these symbols, he manages to arrange them in an orderly space compared to the cluttered space of Campin, or what may be the remainder of the horror vacua perhaps seen in Broederlam. A sort of visually observed perspective is evident in the groups of figures in the background of the lower central panel, which also shows the particular suitability of oil paint to effects such as atmospheric perspective, where things in the distance get lighter, bluer, grayer, less distinct. Jan van Eyck's mastery of reality and textures can be seen in his Man in a Red Turban. Suggestive of what is seen when one peers into a mirror, it is hopefully considered by many to be a self-portrait. Whether it is or isn't is not as important as the fact that this portrait locks onto the viewer. Gardner's text states that this is the first painted portrait in some time to peer out at us, the viewer. The power of the image in confronting the viewer is common to many of the greatest portraits of all time, even in the highly abstract by comparison works of Alberto Giacometti, the great Swiss artist from the 20th century. The importance of this image in terms of its power, technique, and revolution cannot be overstated. Another famous work by Jan van Eyck is his Arnolfini wedding portrait. This painting, like many of the others from this period, is full of symbolism. The removed shoes that you see in the lower left corner symbolize holy ground. The dog symbolizes the bride's fidelity. Think about it. What's a typical dog name? Fido. The broom that you see hanging in the far background symbolizes her wifely duties, and the tiny statue of St. Margaret on a chain will keep her safe in childbirth. Another number of other symbols are suggested for this painting, which is not only a double portrait, but also functions as a marriage license. As seen in the detail in your textbook, Jan van Eyck combined the abilities of the miniaturist and illuminator with an incredible eye for what he perceived to be real. Jan van Eyck's main follower was Petrus Christus, and Christus may have been Jan van Eyck's student. The last of the big three of early Netherlandish painting is Roger van der Weyden. Not particularly interested in disguised symbolism, van der Weyden moves past Van Eyck in presenting a scene of extraordinary drama and action. While Van Eyck was interested in painting what he saw, van der Weyden excelled in painting what he felt. Powerful emotions come to the fore, as this is one of the strongest realizations of the suffering and torment of Christ and the despair of Mary in her sorrow for his death. The tears on the cheeks of the women epitomize what the Italians admired in Flemish art: pictorial brilliance and sentiment. Van der Weyden also proves to be an outstanding colorist, as he employs a rich primary color scheme in this painting. The yellows, reds, and blues dominate and just glow. Van der Weyden's portraits move away from Van Eyck's example as well. His portrait of a lady from 1460, with its broad pattern of shapes and understated color, reveal him to be an artist less interested in texture and more interested in using large, simple shapes, even in the face, to give some clue as to the character of the sitter. The work is very elegant and shows us a contemplative, perhaps even introverted woman of some beauty, physical or otherwise. Roger van der Weyden's influence was great, as during his lifetime his work circulated throughout all of Europe, although in recent times he is not universally thought of highly. Make your own decision as to his merits. I think it's very strong work. I love the pattern that her headdress and her face make in this particular painting. One artist who admired Van Eyck and van der Weyden was Hugo van der Goes. His combination of their ideas, high detail level and intense devotion, makes his work intense and in some ways difficult to understand. Particularly strange is his combination of extreme realism and huge jumps in scale. Some of the odd nature of the work might be due to the emotional difficulties of the artist, who tried to commit suicide at one time because he believed he was possessed by the devil. Now here goes more symbolism. The shoes off the foot symbolize holy ground. The pillar supporting the shed prefigures the pillar to which Christ will be tied. The cow who watches symbolizes the Gentiles, while the donkey who ignores it symbolizes the Jews. The small still life in the foreground contains many symbols. The wheat symbolizes Bethlehem, the house of bread. The flowers symbolize the passion or suffering of the Madonna. Irises were known as sword lilies, and the 7 columbine flowers refer to the 7 sorrows of the Virgin. The grapes refer to the wine of the Eucharist, and the wheat also refers to the communion wafer, the body of Christ. It was no small trick loading these images with all the necessary iconography. Artists of great skill in design solved very difficult problems in this day. Contemporary of Hugo van der Goes was Hans Memling, an artist whose works take on a gentler, more subdued quality. Painted around 1480, this Madonna and Child demonstrates what made Memling the most popular Netherlandish painter of his day, the unabrasive quality of his work. Memling's popularity came despite his German origin. He was extremely wealthy and painted numerous portraits which display more originality than his religious works. His portraits seem to have had a far-reaching influence, as aspects of his work appeared in the work of Giovanni Bellini in Italy. One last major artist remains to be seen in the 15th century, and his name is Hieronymus Bosch. Bosch was an incredibly individualistic artist. To this day, his work ranks among the most inventive paintings ever made. Whether a comment on the morality and folly of human life, or a treatise on alchemy, or both, which is most likely, the Garden of Earthly Delights is one of the most insightful and imaginative images we have yet seen. The contrasting views of Eden and hell are more than enough to make anyone think twice about their religious beliefs. Notice how populated hell is compared to paradise. The fantastic nature of Bosch's images was no doubt of great inspiration to the art of the Surrealists, especially Salvador Dalí. Two aspects of Bosch's technique go hand in hand with his imagery. Rather than being the result of an elaborate plan, like Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, Bosch's work is largely the result of an inspired creative fury. Bosch took full advantage of the new oil media and the immediacy that it can afford the painter. Bosch worked a la prima, a direct method of painting wet into wet, and he applied his paint in the impasto manner of laying thick brushstrokes on the panel, as opposed to slowly building the work up in glazes a la Titian. The major artists of the 15th century in the north were largely confined to the Netherlands. France was weak due to the agony and burden of the 100 Years' War. Therefore, only one French artist of any significance emerged at this time, Jean Fouquet. Part of the Melun diptych, Fouquet's work betrays his Italian training, yet his skill in presenting sharply focused portraits is indicative of the Flemish fashion of the day. He's okay, but he can't compare with the Netherlandish painters. Of lesser importance even is the work of the German artist Stefan Lochner, whose work is fully in keeping with the international style. Lochner was not a revolutionary by any means. Pictured here is his Madonna in the Rose Garden from 1430 to 1435. While Lochner was from northern Germany, Conrad Witz, who we see here, was from the south, and his work is very different indeed. An almost naive approach to form is evident with the hard lines which delineate every object. Yet his work is direct, powerful, and emotional. It's cold almost, and the brilliant red robe of Christ is striking against the dominant green of the sea and the painting. It's interesting to note that while 15th century German artists are of lesser importance, major inventions and innovations in printmaking processes were advanced at this time in Germany. The seeds for 16th century masterworks are sown in works like this Temptation of St. Anthony by Martin Schongauer. This concludes our look at the Northern Renaissance in the 15th century.